Hello, and welcome to Pagan Perspectives. This is a podcast where I give a esoteric and pagan perspective and understanding of issues that we deal with in our mundane lives. I'm your host, Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist and polytheist, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about a philosophical debate, how it affects our lives, because of course, this is a podcast about how things do relate to our lives and how metaphysics intersects with our reality. And what's the truth about the matter? So, this is the free will debate. Is free will real? And I also want to discuss about if it is real or not, what does that mean for our lives? How does that actually affect us? And is this debate really how it seems? Because people, I think, don't quite understand what free will is. And I think they have a really rigid way of thinking about it that's not actually based in reality and is not based in the historic debate that's happened in the past. Because this debate of whether free will exists or not and what that means for our lives has actually been going on since the ancient world. It's a very, very old discussion, and it's a discussion that myth has answers to, that religions have answers to, and that even in the secular mind we argue about, right? Like it's not a topic that has ever disappeared from the human psyche, because we've always wanted to know, why does our world work the way it does? Do things have a meaning? Because the thing is, whether free will exists or not, there's a good and a bad to either of these, right? Because if we take the hard stances, right, that everything is free will or that everything is planned, if everything is planned, then we don't have any sort of autonomy. But if everything is free will, then there's no meaning in anything, right? And you can lack purpose. So I'm going to get into this conversation, what it means. And I want to rope true will into this discussion. So as you guys know, I'm a Thelemite. I have a heavy Thelema influence on my thinking and my work. I find Aleister Crowley to be a very wise spiritual teacher. I know a lot of people have feelings about him. I know people are very polarized on Crowley, but I think it's worth considering his actual work as separate from his provocateur actions and really looking into what he had to think and not necessarily the stunts he pulled, because he wrote a lot about this idea of true will. And people really have a hard time reckoning free will and true will into the same conversation. Some people think they're kind of the same thing, and some people think that true will cannot exist if free will exists, because true will, it posits that there is a sort of correct way to live, but at the same time, you kind of have to choose to follow your true will. So what does true will have to do with it, right? So we're going to talk all about fate, true will, and I want to bring in astrology. I want to bring in these metaphysical conversations, because I think new esotericists, new pagans, new occultists could feel that these things are kind of contradictory. Like, I know people have wrestled with astrology and free will. I know I had a conversation with someone, and this is something I thought about for a long time when I was new, is, okay, so if I have true will, but also astrology is true, is free will real? I've gone on my own journey with this conversation. And, my stance, because I do think it's worth discussing my bias, the reason why I mentioned I'm a perennialist and polytheist is not because I think that's, the purpose of the show. This is not necessarily, my beliefs, the show, right? It's a discussion of how metaphysics affects our lives. And I share many perspectives that I do not agree with, right? I've made many videos and many discussions to show people all stances, right? I don't believe everyone needs to agree with me, but I say what I believe so that you understand where I'm coming from. Because I don't believe in the idea of an unbiased narrator. I don't think that exists, because unbiased is even a biased position, right? Like neutrality doesn't entirely exist. And so I do want to say where I stand on this. I often have called myself a determinist, and that's a little bit oversimplified how I feel. I'm kind of, okay. I think free will exists, but I also think fate exists at the same time. I'm kind of more towards the middle of this conversation. But even then, I lean more on the determinist side. So what I'm going to say is, I think to begin this conversation, we need to understand that free will and hard determinism are kind of a spectrum. It's not really a dichotomous conversation, and I'm definitely more on the determinist side, but I'm not all the way 100% on the determinist side. I think free will exists to an extent, but not to its highest extent, right? So I think it's worth defining what free will is, because I paused it as a A-B question so far, because a lot of people have this debate as an A-B question. There is either free will, we make all our own choices and there's no plan, or there's fate. We make zero choices, everything is predetermined for us, and everything's planned, right? This is kind of how people think about it, right? Either agency exists or agency does not exist, right? So I want to define what free will means in a definitional sense. So free will actually does not mean that we have no plan. It does not mean there is entire, It doesn't necessarily mean as much as people make it out to be. Literally defined, free will is the ability to make choices and the idea that human beings have the ability to make choices that we genuinely make, right? That we make choices of our own agency and we're able to make choices, that choices exist. Um, the thing that's the debate is what does that mean, right? And how true is that? Like, how many choices do we actually make is really where the debate comes in. How much free will do we have? Because I don't think there's anyone, if they really take free will to its highest extent, right, and say absolutely nothing is planned, that they fully believe that. Because the thing is, there's certain things that even biologically and physiologically we do not have agency over. So, okay, we don't choose, like let's take this really far, right? We don't choose what species we are, right? Like if you're listening to this, you're a human. I would hope, I assume. Are there any robots listening to this conversation? Maybe there's someone who's fed it to an AI. Maybe an AI is listening. Okay, if you're an AI, you don't get to not be an AI. You're an AI. But yeah, I mean, I don't think any dogs can understand anything I'm saying. But we don't choose to be humans, right? We are humans, and within being a human, there is only so many choices we can make, right? Like we can't start photosynthesizing, right? That doesn't work. No matter how much those like weird butthole sunning people say like humans can live off air and chi, like that's not true, right? So physiologically, there are some limits to free will, right? But how much limits they are, that's the conversation. Because some people really do believe that there is no sort of fate. Everything is about our choices. And that's a double-edged sword of a belief, because on one hand, that gives us complete radical autonomy. That's kind of a liberating idea. Like we choose our own destiny, we choose our own path in the world. There's something really optimistic about that. And something like I think people who are Americans like me, that kind of goes with the American spirit in a lot of ways. Like we're kind of a culture of real autonomy and a belief in that, or at least we were at one point in time. Now, the dark side to free will being in its highest extent beyond, of course, physiological limits, right? Let's say free will exists to its fullest extent, except, of course, physiological things, right? You're born in this body, you're born with, say, whatever diseases you have, right? We're born, personality appears to be somewhat kind of genetically determined, not entirely, right? There's certain things that are genetically determined, right? But let's say everything that's not entirely genetically determined by our DNA and structure, right? Let's say all of that is complete free will. There's a double there's a negative side to that, because of course it's complete freedom, but at the same time it can kind of feed into a nihilistic belief that life has no purpose, right? And that life has no meaning. And I think this type of position can kind of, in a sense, make some people feel very lost. Because the truth is, people, when they're told they have radical autonomy over their lives, they go one of two ways. They either are the type of person who's like really excited by that and are like, I can forge my own destiny, I have complete power. And then there are other people who feel completely purposeless and they lack, right? They are like, oh my God, there's no path for me, there's no set course for me. And I think both of those are legitimate psychological responses. I think those are just different personalities. I don't think either is really wrong. But I think we do need to consider that in a full free will worldview, right? If we're taking free will to this hardest extent, right? If we're pretending this is an A-B question, I'm going to get into how it's not an A-B question, but let's go into those debates, right? If it is a hard A-B question, if we're saying A is free will exists to its highest extent besides obvious genetic determinations, which I don't think anyone would argue with me on that one, right? It does struggle with a lot of philosophy and a lot of religion, right? Because a lot of religions and philosophies have ideas about the meaning of life, right? That they have an idea that there is some sort of purpose to humanity, there's some sort of higher purpose. And if free will is taken to its highest extent, there kind of is no higher purpose, right? There is no higher meaning. You would have to create your own meaning. And for some people, that's awesome. For other people, not so much. I think of the term optimistic nihilism, which is basically life has no purpose, life has no meaning, but that's great because we make our own meaning and we have our own choice, right? This kind of goes into nihilism. But I want to bring this forward. Not all free will believers are hard free will beliefs. I'm going to call it hard and soft free will, hard determinism, soft determinism. And I know hard determinism is also a term for a metaphysical position. For this conversation, let's just kind of think of it as a spectrum, right? Now, if we're talking about, extreme determinism, right? The hardest form of determinism, there is no such thing as free will at all, right? Let's go there. So determinism, and I want to define this term. Determinism is a theological term for the idea that everything is determined, right? Determinism, right? You can hear it in the word. It basically means that there is a plan. And there's another term that kind of overlaps with it called fatalism, or the belief in fate. That there is some sort of, fate that is existing, right? That there are perhaps spirits, like the Greek side called the fates, that sort of string our lives together with these red strings with a little like cat's cradle type thing, right? Or, I mean, in Christian positions, there's a term called predestination, where basically, and this is really only believed by Calvinists, which are a particular type of Christians, that like literally every single thing is determined to its highest extent, including who goes to heaven and hell. That is determined. And this is a really easy way for me to explain why not all determinism is this version of a determinism, because while Calvinists believe this, right? A lot of Calvinists literally believe some souls, even before they're born, were destined to go to hell and some to heaven, right? Like, it's your fate what happens to you, right? Other Christians do believe God has a plan, right? Like let's say Catholics and Orthodox, right? And Episcopals. I grew up Episcopal, right? And I lived in New York, so obviously I spent a lot of time around Catholics because most Christians in New York City are Catholics. I don't live in New York now. I grew up around Protestants overwhelmingly, but I didn't actually grow up around like Calvinist type Protestants. I grew up more around mainline Protestants, and I did grow up around some Mormons, which are kind of like wacky Christianity, Paul Atreides Christianity. That's what I'm going to call that. But anyways, like a mainline Protestant or a Catholic or whatever. Basically, they think like, yeah, God has a plan. Some things are determined, but at the end of the day, you choose whether you go to heaven or not based on your actions and your faith, right? Like that is a determinist position. Like, yeah, like God has a plan. There's going to be revelations at some point, but you don't necessarily like, it's not predetermined for you whether you're going to go to heaven or hell, right? And so that's kind of where things start going into the middle. And a lot of people I actually think are more towards the middle of the spectrum. It's just whether what side they fall on that I think is the real debate, because I don't think the idea that there is fate and that there is some level of free will actually fully contradict. I don't think they do. I think that it depends on how you're defining free will, because literally free will is just the ability to make choices and the ability to decide your destiny to some extent. It doesn't mean that destiny doesn't exist at all. And I want to talk about fate. So fate is the idea that everyone has a destiny, a thing that will happen to them, right? That you're born with a path that will happen to you, right? That you are part of some cosmic greater event, and how much control you have over that fate. Now that is where theology starts really fighting. Because, well, one, it's hard to fully know, and two, yeah, how much power do we have, right? I think astrology is a really good example of this, because people who believe in astrology have really different answers to this question. Because obviously, and I think we can be obvious with this, right? Astrology is a fatalist position, right? Astrology is somewhat deterministic. Like it just is, right? Astrology posits that on the moment of your birth, you are given a natal chart. Depending on where the stars were during your time of birth, that kind of determines your life path, because you are born with the correspondences of that astrological moment at your moment of birth. And then that every day you go through the life, it's the current transits, which are the current positions of the stars, affecting your natal positions. And how they relate is how we see astrology unfold in our lives, is basically how much that snapshot relates to what's happening in the moment. And you can see this when people do astrology for organizations too, right? If you're doing, say, the astrology of your Wiccan coven, right? You pick a chart based on when that coven was formed, and then you consider what's happening now in the sky and how they relate, right? And astrology posits that, large swaths of our life are determined by this. Now, it doesn't mean the stars themselves determine these things, right? It's just that that's a representation of something bigger, right? The reason why the movements of the stars are of interest to the astrologers, it's a very clear way of seeing what the as above is. So as above, so below is a metaphysical law that posits that the microcosm and the macrocosm are interconnected, and that what happens in one affects the other. If you've ever seen someone make a puppet or a voodoo doll, so to speak, they're not really called voodoo dolls, they're called puppets, but let's go there, right? If you've ever heard of folk magic traditions where people make voodoo dolls, and then they put someone's face on the doll, and then they stab a nail into the doll, and then the person has something bad happen to them. That's below, so above, right? The doll is a microcosmic representation of that person, and then what's done to the doll affects that person, because these things interrelate, because that doll is a correspondence to the person. So basically a study that everything completely interrelates. And the movement of the stars affect our lives because they interrelate. There are correspondence that matches. The law of correspondence is a term that basically explains this, like all correspondences sort of equal other things, right? Like red and Mars correspond, not literally because, Mars creates the color red, but because they both represent the same thing. Is that all these different metaphysical representations all completely link. And a lot of magical practice is based on this idea, right? The reason why a athame represents the masculine principle and fire is because it's a correspondence of those things, right? So when we're looking at as above, so below, there's inherently a little bit of a deterministic quality to it, especially if you think about astrology. So with astrology, you can see a lot about people's futures, right? You can see a lot. You can see based on someone's natal chart, their personality, their life path, and a lot of their struggles, right? Like if you look at someone's immunicoli, you can see their family life and their past. If you look at someone's Chiron, you can see their traumas and their pain points, right? And that's all because these things interconnect. And a lot of people wrestle with the idea that astrology does mean that certain things are meant to happen in your life, right? Because those planets are going to transit in a way that relates directly to your chart and affects you, right? The Saturn return that happens in someone's late 20s is when Saturn returns to the point it was when they were born. And during that period in time, people have to take on a lot more responsibility because Saturn has to do with commitments, responsibility, limitations. And that's why you see in ages like 27 to 31, so many people getting married, having children, right? That's not completely random. That's not societal. And in the past, the way that played out is that responsibilities were taken on at that time, right? Certain ages represent certain things because of as above, so below. And so that inherently means there's some level of fate that must exist if you believe in astrology, right? There must be some sense of fate going on. And this is one of the criticisms people have against astrology, right? That it is inherently kind of deterministic, that no matter what you do, there are some things that are true about you, that are determined about you. Certain things about your personality, your career, and how people perceive you are determined from birth if astrology is true. Same thing with tarot, right? When someone does a future reading in tarot, they are seeing your future. Now, amongst astrologers and tarot readers, there's a lot of debate about what this means. Now, with future tarot cards, some people argue that they are your guaranteed future, and some people argue that it's your future if you do not see it as a warning or see it as an omen. If, say, someone's doing a tarot reading for you and they pull like the tower about your future, you could see that as a way that perhaps you could then use your free will to change your fate by knowing that that is your fate if nothing changes, right? And with tarot, I do agree with this view. I think tarot is your fate so long as you continue on your current course. So whenever I'm doing a tarot reading for people and I see a really horrible future card, I tell them, hey, you still have the free will to change your course. But if you don't, this is where you'll end up now. And then with astrology, I mean, it's less, there's less power there because tarot and astrology are fundamentally different things and they work differently. With astrology, like if I see, someone's Saturn return coming up, I mean, I know their Saturn return is going to happen. But, and this is where they start to interplay, is with the understanding of astrology and tarot, you can then use your free will to change your current actions. Because the truth is, whether fate exists or not, you still in a day-to-day life live as if you have free will. So even if free will doesn't exist, it still feels as if you have it, right? It doesn't really change your day-to-day life. But yes, astrology implies some level of fate. Now, there are some people who really are into astrology and reject this by saying that astrology is like archetypes and whatnot. I don't really think that makes sense, and that's certainly not how astrology is understood in a historic sense. So astrology is a strong example of a fatalist and deterministic belief set. But astrology, once again, it's not necessarily hard determinism or the highest form of determinism, because the highest form of determinism does genuinely argue that there is no such thing as free will, that you never make a choice, right? That even what you eat for breakfast tomorrow is predetermined for you. And when it comes to these type of ideas, how it is predetermined now, that becomes a debate even within that camp of like, was this written from the beginning of time, right? Predestination or predeterminism, whatever you want to call it, right? It's basically that at the beginning of the Earth's creation, a creator figure planned every single thing out permanently. And then there are people who have a looser idea that there are spirits like the fates who are constantly weaving our lives. Like when we're born, our fate is created for us, but before our creation, that wasn't so much the case. So once again, there's deviation within this. There's sort of arguments amongst this. And, when it comes to other things that are broader, it also can become a little interesting because you can kind of believe also that determinism and fate exists on like a broad level, but on a more micro level, it exists to less of an extent. I think Buddhism is a really interesting example of this, and really the Dharmic Eastern religions as a whole kind of act like this because, okay, so when we're looking at the yugas. I think the yugas are a really good way of explaining this. The yugas come from Hinduism, but you see kind of similar ideas in Buddhism. You see similar ideas in other traditions. Within, like Thelema, there's aeons. Aeons and yugas are basically the same thing, and they basically correspond to like the same thing. The yugas are a bit longer, but you get what I'm saying, right? So there are four yugas within Hindu theology. There is Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvarpa Yuga, and Kali Yuga. So I'm going to go through these. So the oldest yuga is the Golden Age, and these constantly cycle. I mean, saying oldest is just in relative to us; they're constantly cycling. So, the Golden Age, and then the Silver Age. You see, it's starting to get worse. You're starting to see people become less virtuous. You're starting to see the world get worse, and then you get the Dvarpa Yuga, which is the Bronze Age. Once again, it's continuing to get worse, and then you get Kali Yuga, our current age, which is like pure chaos, turmoil, no virtue, everything bad. But at the end of the Kali Yuga, it flips back into the Satya Yuga. Now, how does that happen? That chaos creates a new order that then creates a new golden age, right? So it's constantly cycling. I mean, I've discussed before how I think the Kali Yuga and the Thelemic Aeon of Horus actually refer to the same phenomenon from a different perspective. Because in the Kali Yuga, right, we're in like the worst version of history ever. Like, it's very pessimistic. It says that right now, like, we're in a period of immense turmoil, right? There's no old structure. Something new has to form. And then, Aeon of Horus is basically the same thing. If you read the third chapter of the Book of the Law, Rahorquit, which is the chapter about what the Aeon of Horus really represents and what it means, you see it's chaotic and crazy, but at the end, something new emerges that's golden, right? The Aeon of Horus is just a way more optimistic way of looking at the Kali Yuga, but they describe the exact same phenomenon, right? An age of turmoil and chaos that then ends with a new order, a new higher order, a new spiritual awakening, creating a new structure, right? A new golden age coming out of the chaos and turmoil. I like both of these interpretations. I think they're both correct. I think they're just like a glass half empty and glass half full way of looking at the same phenomenon because they're describing the same thing, right? It's just one is a little bit more optimistic about it. But even that, like, let's look at these yugas and aeons, right? Because aeons are similar, right? There's the feminine aeon, then the masculine aeon, then the aeon of the crown and conquering child, and so it repeats. Now, some people interpret that there's also a fourth aeon after this, which is like the Aeon of Mot or the Aeon of Peace and Stability, and then it cycles back through. I don't like the idea of an Aeon of Mot because I don't think that actually represents that cycle too well. I think you would have to like circle back. Whatever. This is semantics discussion at this point. I mean, Aeon of Mot, you can make a good argument for existing too, because that is kind of like a golden age. I don't know. I mean, I'm a little more agnostic on Aeon of Mot now that I'm thinking about it for a moment, but aeons, yugas, right? These both are large cosmic cycles that exist, right? They're cosmic cycles that are constantly looping. But within these religions, we're not looking at hard determinism, especially in Thelema. We're not looking at hard determinism. So we're seeing that these big cyclical ages are determined, but perhaps, it's not going all the way through, right? There is some level of free will within our lives. There's still a level of autonomy. There's still a level of change. There's still a level of choice. It's just the big things are planned. And then, like, what you're going to get for breakfast tomorrow. Now, God didn't, like, choose that before you were born. Right. There's this term compatibilism, which is basically the idea that these things can go together. They're compatible. I think a lot of people are that. Now, there is, of course, more distinction to what compatibilism means in a deeper sense, but really it just means that they can coexist, which I think makes the most sense. And I'm so bad at being unbiased, actually, now that I start yapping. But yeah, I mean, I think they can coexist. And I want to talk about, I've gotten into samsara, I've gotten into the yugas. I want to talk about samsara, actually. So samsara is from Buddhism. Samsara and the yugas go together very, very well. But the samsara is the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth, right? So within samsara, as we reincarnate, we are being reborn. So basically, you're born, you live your life, and then you're reincarnated. And based on the karma, or basically good or bad things that you've done throughout the course of your life, that determines your next reincarnation. And so if you have like a bad reincarnation, you come back as an animal, right? Your fate was to be an animal. But then within that life, you still have a level of determinants of like, how much karma are you going to accrue? Like, you didn't choose how you were, like, you were chosen how you reincarnate based on your past life. So like, you actually chose your own fate. You actually determined your own future in this worldview. So there's determinism, but it's like self-determinism. Like, you determined the fate that comes into this life, but within this life, you have the power to break past that. And by achieving enlightenment or nirvana, you actually are so holy, so enlightenment, so sinless that you were able to escape the cycle entirely and unite and get nirvana, which nirvana is very similar to the Western idea of uniting with the Godhead, right? Like, you escape this cosmic cycle and you annihilate the soul and finally reunite with the highest form of being. Because while we are within this form of being, while we're within reincarnation, we are trapped in this form, right? We are not the highest form of enlightenment, right? If you look at the like divine hierarchy of existence, we are not at the top. You can get closer and closer to the top by living a more virtuous life, by having better karma. And so, yes, like, there is some determinants for you, but at the same time, you have that agency to decide whether you get good or bad karma within this life. And so, When you come into this life, you actually chose your karmic debt. That was determined for you by you, right? Like, if you reincarnate with really bad circumstances, that was actually your actions and your choice, right? You determined that for you. But then within this life, you have the ability to sort of unwork that. And so basically that's a partial determinism, right? Like, it was determined for you what this life would be, but what you make of it, now that's your free will. And at the same time, though, there is even more determinism than that, because it's still determined that you are part of samsara, and that the only way to escape samsara that you must determine is by breaking past this and going to nirvana. And really, what I see is once I look at this and think deeply, is that really any sort of idea that there is a cosmic law requires some sort of understanding of fate, right? It's kind of hard to be a spiritual person and get rid of fate entirely and think that everything's completely random, right? That's really hard to square with any sort of religion. Now, there are some that do, right? Like really more modern systems, like say chaos magic, where nothing's really given an answer or a purpose, right? You can square that very easily. We'll go like, well, like everything is, mind, everything is random, like everything is true at once, and it's all chaotic and hectic, right? Like with those systems, I mean, that's pretty easy to square without having fate, right? Like, oh, it's just like a hectic world, like crazy things happen, like all the gods exist, and there's like whatever. I mean, that's pretty easy. But I think if you're part of like a rigid or existing system, it's kind of hard to break out of some idea of fate. The question is just how much fate exists. I think that's kind of the real argument, because even if you believe in astrology, you can still believe we have some form of control over our actions, right? Like, a big reason why people look at their natal chart is not just to get answers about the future, but to understand themselves so they can better themselves, right? Like, a reason why you might get a natal reading is to see, like, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And there are practices that exist, like planetary remediation, where you work with your natal chart to then heal imbalances, to heal deficiencies, to become a better person using techniques like that. So I don't know, even within fate, there's still a level of autonomy. And I want to get into true will now. So true will is a idea within Thelema, but it's kind of a perennial idea. There's a very similar idea from Eliphas Levi. I can't pronounce that man's name. I'm so sorry, guys. Every time I bring him up, I say it wrong, called pure will. Very, very similar. Schopenhauer's will is also quite similar. That's a secular philosopher, but quite similar. I think Schopenhauer as a thinker, like, got so close to creating religion. Like, he became such a good philosopher that in his secular philosophy, he essentially did metaphysics. But yeah, people like Schopenhauer's will, Crowley's true will, the idea of a higher purpose is also very similar, right? And what these ideas come to is that within us, there is a will, or a thing from our intuitive or irrational mind, the part of the consciousness that is not the rational perceptor, right? Because we have the rational mind, the thinking mind, the logistical mind, and then we have the will. And the will does come from somewhere else. That's pretty much agreed upon. Like, when you try to conquer your mind, you're not conquering your will, you're conquering your rational mind. You're using your will to overpower your rational mind so that you're able to have transcendent states like meditation, astral projection, and ritual, right? So the will comes from the choleric self, and the nature of the will is really interesting, because the will is what keeps us alive, and the will does seem to have the ability to defy our normal expectations, right? Because obviously things like manifestation and ritual are a product of will, but even on a physical level, when people are in danger, right? Like if you're being chased by a tiger, I don't know, that's a scenario where the will would kick in. It does. And the survival instinct is, in a sense, the lowest form of the will, right? It's the base of the will. At the base of the will is the will to survive, right? The will is a very, very strong force within us, and it's not our rational mind. Now, true will is where the will begins to align with the rational mind, and where the will begins to guide the rational mind. So the will, we understand, is kind of instinctual, it's kind of choleric, it's deep within us. And what we want to do to have spiritual growth and to truly understand ourselves and master ourselves is find our true will. So true will is essentially a higher form of will. Now, I want to be clear, will is not want. So when you want something, it's like a craving. I think of want as craving because sometimes people do define want as a way that does overlap with the will. So sometimes saying will is not want can be a little bit confusing. Because if, say, you want something that is your true will, because the thing is, we do want our true will, right? Our true will is our purpose. Our true will that brings us joy. So, like, we want our true will. That's not what I'm saying. But anything you want is not your true will. Does that make any sense? Want can be will, but want is not necessarily will. So, like, let's say an IO131 posted a really good image on Twitter where it was a joke. It was kind of funny. IO131 is often funny, if not a little bit cynical and pessimistic. where basically, and I'm going to pull up his little comic he posted. So it's a person who, I assume this is a Thalamite teacher or image, Thelamite man, Thelema bro. And it's two panels. And the first panel is do what thou wilt does not mean do what you want. And then the next panel is the guy at like a 7-Eleven. I don't know where he lives, where chips are $1 and milk is $2. That would be really nice, if only. If only groceries were not that expensive. My local grocery store is not that lucky. But basically, he's buying chips or cookies. They kind of look like chips on the bag. I don't know. He's some sort of cookie. Maybe they're vanilla wafers. I don't know. Milanos? I like Milanos. That's a good cookie. Anyways, he says, it is my will to eat cookies. So that's obviously making fun of this idea that will is want. And when people say will and want are not the same, that sometimes they could be wrong. Obviously, it's no one's true will to eat the cookies. But, and this is where the but comes in, keeping yourself nourished, though no one's being nourished from cookies. Let's say he was buying kale or meat. Okay, I'm gonna make it a little more interesting. So let's say he's buying meat, right? So buying the meat, now that could be part of someone's true will, because if you don't like feed yourself healthy foods and good foods, then you're not gonna achieve your true will, right? Because you're gonna like be malnourished and starve. I don't think it's anyone's true will to have a vanilla wafer, but if it was something healthy, I mean, in a sense, yeah, I mean, that wouldn't be wrong, because you need that to achieve your true will, right? You need to be healthy. You need to be fed. If you're like, emaciated and anorexic and starving yourself, like, you're not going to achieve your true will, right? You're derailed. So I'm getting on a tangent. Basically, yeah, like sometimes what we want is in line with our true will, right? Often, like, let's say your true will relates to like having a family and falling in love and becoming really good at meditation, right? Let's say those are part of your true will, because those are things that are often part of people's true wills, right? You probably also want those things. You probably sit and you're like, yeah, I want love. I want to be loved. I want spiritual growth. But your craving type wants, those are never your true will. So, people crave, like, say, a cigarette or I don't know, a crumble cookie. I've never had a crumble cookie, but they seem really terrible for you, but they seem addictive at the same time. So I went with that. But like anything you would crave that's bad for you, right? Craving is definitely not your true will. So it's kind of a little more of a complicated interplay than want versus will, but it is still somewhat true, right? Things you just want are not your true will. A lot of people misinterpret true will as like a life in which you do whatever you want. And that's how a lot of people interpret free will. When I went on Wikipedia, which I don't, by the way, research on Wikipedia, but I like to check to make sure I like spell my titles right, because my spelling's a little difficult. So I go on Wikipedia before I record just to make sure I like name my episode correctly. Like, I wanted to make sure I was spelling determinism right, because I might put that in the title. And they have this beautiful image that depicts free will. And it is a guy holding a dirt bike, jumping, and he's above clouds. Presumably he has dirt jumped into heaven, or like, and I brought this over to my roommate, because I was like, okay, we need to talk about the dirt jumping bike guy. Did he like jump out of a plane? Like, why is he so high up? Is it Photoshop? And basically says this is the result of free will. It is his free will to, dirt bike jump. And some people think true will is like that idea, because people have this idea that like free will is when I do whatever I want because I can. And there's a lot of TikToks. I love citing TikToks. I always feel like I sound so silly citing TikToks, but it's where the conversation is happening. So it's important to consider, where people say, when I go on a trip to DC in the middle of the night because I remember I have free will, when I eat pasta with Thai sauce, even though you're not supposed to do that because I remember I have free will, when it randomly hits me that I have free will and I go to the dance club by myself. Now, a lot of these things seem pleasant, right? But they're obviously not anyone's true will. They are a choice they've made. And dirt jump biking into heaven is probably not your true will either, unless, I don't know, you become like some expert dirt bike jump athlete. Is that anyone except people in Red Bull commercials? Must be someone's job. Someone is in those Red Bull commercials where they do like stunts. Do you think like Red Bull doesn't hire people unless they're like willing to die? I wonder. Anyways, people think true will is doing whatever you want. People think free will is doing whatever they want. So a lot of people have basically said true will and free will are the exact same thing. And I said, no context at one point, I'm a determinist and I believe in true will. And of course, I'm not a hard determinist. That's an over-exaggeration of my position. But I remember people were like the amount of like red flags that went up, you would have thought it was like a parade in Russia like in the 1980s. Like people were like, I don't know what you're talking about. True will is obviously a choice. True will is something you choose. And to an extent that's true, to an extent that's not. Because what would it mean to find your true will if true will was just your life path, right? Why on earth would we do any rituals if true will was just like going to your high school guidance counselor and then telling you based on a personality inventory what career you should have, right? That's not how that works. So, how do people find their true will? What's the ritual? So, the ritual that a lot of people do is they attain knowledge and conversation with their holy guardian angel. The holy guardian angel is an angelic spirit that is attached to you, that you must connect with. Now, they are attached to you no matter what, but unless you make spiritual growth, you cannot talk to them. And then they help you discover your true will and follow it. So, if true will was just a bunch of choices you make, that it's just free will, dirt bike jumping into heaven, right? Why on earth would you need to do any sort of ritual? Because why would anything external to you know, right? Because the holy guardian angel is you, but also not you, right? It's like your connection to the higher realms. It's part of you, but it's beyond you, right? It's a sort of spiritual double that links you to something higher, right? So why on earth would you need to do that if true will is just making as many choices as you want and like being empowered slay? That doesn't make sense. So what we start to realize is your true will is given to you by the divine. Your true will is your destiny. Your true will is your fate. Your true will is the path you are meant to live. But the interesting part is you do still have the free will to reject that choice. Yes, there is a divine plan. There is a broader cosmic cycle. That's why aeons exist. That's why yugas exist. That's why astrology is true. But you still have some level of choice about whether to follow that true will. And some people could take this in an interesting way where they argue that that's not even correct, because Crowley did write about this whole, okay, this people hate this sentence. He said the slave shall serve. A lot of people freak out when they read that. Basically what he meant is not anything about like enslaving people or like making people slaves. That's not the point, but basically that some people who reject their will, people who, choose to not ever grow as a person or, achieve divine heights, who just basically choose to like, watch porn all day and smoke weed and do nothing with their life, right? That they have essentially chosen a form of spiritual slavery for their life. And what they will do with their whole life is serve that slavery, right? You could be enslaved by your carnal desires. You could be enslaved by, your drugs, right? You could be enslaved by all sorts of things. Like slavery is more like a state of mind. And also people who are, rigidly trapped into a paradigm, like say, I don't know, certain Christian paradigms where the entire thing, you don't do any sort of mysticism yourself. You don't do any personal growth yourself. You just sort of kneel all the time. And you just, you do nothing of individual thought or growth. You do no sort of mysticism, especially the forms of Christianity, like evangelical and certain forms of Protestantism where you aren't even allowed to be mystics, right? You aren't allowed to like have personal experiences with God at all, right? You're turned against like praying to God yourself or praying to Mary or whatever, right? Like you're just told to do nothing all the time. In a sense, is that not a form of spiritual slavery? And so you could make an argument, this could be a case someone could make, is that those people were sort of, in a sense, their destiny was to be a spiritual slave, and people who find their true will, it was just their destiny to find their true will. Now, I wouldn't go that far, but I do think that's a legitimate case that could be made against true will and free will coexisting, that free will might not exist, and the people who find their true will sort of destined to do that. Now, I don't really know anyone who's argued that. I'm sure there's someone who feels that way. I could see the perspective when I was creating this, so I'm sure someone has thought of that before or wondered that. So now what I want to get into is what on earth does it mean for us if free will doesn't exist or does exist? So the thing is, we can't be certain, right? We can know these metaphysical ideas. We can understand astrology is true. We can understand the gods are real. We can understand all this. But the actual nature of free will does elude us, right? Certain religions have an answer for this, but we can't be certain, right? There's certain things we cannot be certain of, right? So even with my theory that things are mostly determined, but we still have some level of free will, because that is how I feel, I can't be sure I'm right. I could be wrong. Complete free will could exist, or no free will could exist. I mean, if I discover either of those are true, I wouldn't be shocked. I mean, I would be, if true free will to the highest extent was true, I think I'd be more shocked than the alternative, but like, I can't know. I could easily be wrong on this. And I would not be shocked if this is one of my theological positions that I shift on over the course of my life, right? Like I'm not, 100% set on this position, because I think this is one we can't truly get an answer to, because you can't really like have a direct experience with a God where they sort of show you this. Like, you can have direct spiritual experiences that make you certain the divine exists, right? People see ghosts all the time. People talk to the gods, right? With free will, that's one of those higher mysteries, right? That's one of those higher questions that is much more elusive. So I think we need to not lose our shit about this, okay? I know I yapped for like 40 minutes about whether or not it's true and what that would mean, but the reality is, on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't matter. Because this is the thing, is even if we are living out a full destiny that was completely created for us, we still have to live that destiny. And so if you were to hear all this and then crash out, right, and like lose your mind because you think free will isn't real, and then like do nothing with your life, even if you're not truly making those choices, you still are kind of making those choices. And so in a sense, is our ability to make decisions, if that is determined for us, if we crash out, then that's also determined for us. So it doesn't really make a difference, is what I'm saying, because in practice, you do have to make choices, right? In our lives, it feels as if we are making choices. We might not really be making choices. That could be an illusion, right? The idea of choice could be an illusion. Choice could be fake, but we still basically have to make choices on a day-to-day basis, right? We essentially have to do that, right? We essentially have to have choices. So, if free will is not real, literally nothing changes, okay? On a day-to-day basis, absolutely nothing changes. If free will entirely exists, absolutely nothing changes. If it's somewhere in the middle, absolutely nothing changes. You need to focus on your path, okay? You need to focus on your path. And I think this is one of those philosophical questions we should ponder and think about, but we also need to remember, doesn't matter, right? It's not something to lose sleep over. I mean, it's an existentially, I think it's kind of terrifying whether either is true to its highest extent. Honestly, it's kind of like a scary thing to think that you have no sort of autonomy or that you have no plan for your life. I think both of those are scary in different ways. So I guess in a sense, which one you would want to be true is kind of a pick your scary, right? I think a lot of people gutturally have a one that they would prefer to be true, right? Which one would make them more comfortable, whether there's someone who likes freedom or less freedom, right? But the truth is, doesn't change anything. You still have to find your true will. You still have to make it through the day. You still have to decide whether to eat the cookies or not, right? So, yeah, doesn't matter. You can do what you want with your life, and you have power over your life, even if you don't really have power. Even if that power is an illusion, it still feels like you have the power. So the power still, in a sense, exists. So, yeah, I mean, doesn't change anything. Focus on your spiritual path and try not to have an existential crisis. Yeah, just push it off. Don't pay attention to it. So that's all I have to say on free will and whether free will exists or not, or if it could kind of exist and kind of not exist at the same time, and kind of the nature of free will and our choices in the world. If you really like the show, please join the podcast Patreon. That's how it's supported. You get a pre-show alongside every single episode, a bonus episode 8 times a year. Oh my god, I can't believe I almost got that wrong. And yeah, you get awesome stuff, and you get all the podcast episodes early. You can also find me under Darling, DAT Darling, on every single platform under the sun. I also am a tarot reader and astrologer, and you can book my readings. It'll be in the description below. And yeah, check out my YouTube channel. That's where I'm best. I've been doing a lot more work on Substack, so I've been writing like more articles and stuff. So those are probably the two things you should check out the most, is my YouTube channel, which if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube is the same channel, or my Substack. So go to .darling.substack.com or the .darling YouTube channel, DAAT Darling. And yeah, I mean, that's all I really have to say. Thank you for listening to Pagan Perspectives. This is a podcast that gives an esoteric insight into the mundane issues we deal with. And have an amazing day, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye!